Hello, packages, parsers, and programs. I'm riffing once again on a limerick from last year about GenAI and AppSec. There once was an LLM created for the purpose of having code rated. It scanned some JS and saw such a mess that now we have to have it sedated. And so this week we talk with Dan Moore about bringing strong authentication and granular authorization to the world of agents and everything associated with agents. Try some TypeScript and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Ever feel like your network infrastructure is stuck in the past? Meet Meter, the company reimagining what it means to get and stay online. Meter delivers full-stack networking, wired, wireless, and cellular, all in one seamless, scalable, and secure solution. From hardware design and firmware to software deployment and support, Meter streamlines every part of your network while giving you all the control and transparency you need. Whether you're managing a branch office, retail stores, or a massive data center, Meter gives you performance, reliability, and the visibility you need to stay in control. Thanks to Meter for sponsoring. Go to securityweekly.com/meter to book a demo now. That's securityweekly.com/meter. METER. Zero trust is clearly the future as threats get faster, quieter, and harder to detect. But implementing it shouldn't disrupt the business. ThreatLocker enforces default deny and execution in a way that remains enterprise-ready, scalable, and operationally clean. Unknown software is stopped cold. Trusted apps stay contained, and drift is locked down across the environment. It's zero trust that works in real enterprises and prepares you for the threats ahead. See why CISOs are adopting it at securityweekly.com/threatlocker. This is episode 369, recorded February 9th, 2026. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and John Kinsella will be with us momentarily. In fact, he is here right now. John, you're coming in hot. How's it going?
I'm here by the bell.
Here by the bell. Well, John made it just in time, but everyone else, you have plenty of time, about a month, a little over a month, to prepare for saving $100 on your RSAC 2026 All Access Pass. RSAC 2026 will take place March 23rd to 26th here in San Francisco. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC26 and use the code 56U5SecWeekly. Hope to see you there. Dan Moore is a Senior Director for CIAM Strategy and Identity Standards at Fusion Auth. He helps customers and community members create solutions. He contributes to identity standards and educates developers about Auth and OAuth. His writing includes Letters to a New Developer and 97 Things Every Cloud Engineer Should Know. I'm sure there's at least 3 more in there. We can make it a round number. And he's been writing software for over 25 years. Hello again, Dan. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Glad to have you back. And as if people remember, we usually do talk with you about authentication, authorization types of topics. And I think one of the most salient topics today, or relevant topics, is authentication, authorization, identity, as it relates to MCPs or agents, or however anybody are putting a horde or a mess of agents all together at once. Because I'll offer up that, sure, we want these agents to do things on our behalf, but we need to know who that identity is, or at least perhaps we should know. So that's at least my perspective that I was in the back of my mind thinking of reaching out to you. And lo and behold, you've been paying attention to especially MCP and its journey on the standard, the specification. Tell us a little bit about just what you've seen from that MCP aspect and this topic.
Yeah, and I think the correct term is a swarm of agents, I believe, is the grouping.
I knew it was an S word.
Yeah, I think that MCP is one of those interesting standards that has really evolved a lot over time. In November 2024, it was initially released, and it's had 3 or 4 revisions since then. And each time tends to get a little deeper. And the authorization and authentication piece is something that I've been following along with. And they've done a great job of what I would say is one of the key things that I've learned as I've dug more into the agents world is there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There are definitely different aspects of agents, but like there's a lot that we can take from, for instance, the API learnings from the early 2010s and apply that to the world of agents. And one of the ways MCP has done this is they've integrated OAuth 2.1 and some other IETF standards into how I, as a user, can authorize an MCP client, which could be an agent, it could be just a piece of desktop software, to access resources at third-party service providers or in my own systems on my behalf.
And part of this is also, we're still talking about the early days. I mean, you made a call back to the ancient days of 2024 when we first heard of, MCPs. But I wanted to pick on that point too about the API, because on the one hand, I agree. I think we should tease out a little bit more what you mean about not reinventing the wheel, but I'm also joking or smiling a little bit. Does this mean we need to bring back SOAP and WSDL and all these like overkill of XML blobs to define what we're doing?
No, I think that, but I think that I think that the problems that they solved around discovery, around definition, this is, I don't remember that a WSDL had gateways, but certainly API gateways were something that was really prevalent. I'm seeing that pop up in the MCP world, where people are now saying, now it's not enough to have one server. I want to have a gateway in front of N servers, and that lets me have a central place to apply policy, a central place to log, and to me that is just kind of an echo of the past. So no, we're not going back to XML hell. I'm not gonna okay. advocate for that, but I do think that we see these problems arise over and over again around new technologies. And MCP, if any of your listeners are not familiar with it, I would just say the simplest way to think about it, and I am waving my hands a little bit here, is that it's just a new friendly API definition for AI agents, is the easiest way to think about MCP.
I see John wanting to. John, we got you thinking.
I'm pondering when to bring this in. I'm not sure there's a perfect time, but if we think about MCP has definitely gotten better, right, over the last year and a half. Authentication, all those type of things. Part of the issue that's popping in my head as you talk about API or comparison there is that's something that we created to run within an application. So the credentials which you're giving between two applications is, I think it's more defined what's going on and what's going to happen there. Part of what people are worried, whether over worried or under worried, is what happens. Those agents are sitting on a machine, which usually hasn't been sandboxed. Usually when you think about an API server or API, it's not going to be going and doing stuff with Unix or commands or going externally doing all these different things. It doesn't have as much agency, to use that phrase. So do you feel like, is the improvement in security, is it good enough yet, I guess? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's a great question. It actually points to the different use cases of MCP, because there is this concept of it's called a standard IOut interface, and then there's a remote interface. And so the things that are running on your local machine are probably going to be using the standard IO interface. And in that case, you really are leveraging the authorization framework around a machine. And so it depends on what operating system you're running on, but in Unix, that might be the permission structure of files and directories. And so MCP doesn't really have anything to say about that. And in the remote world, I would say MCP is really, because it leverages OAuth, is doing stuff at very kind of coarse-grained levels around using OAuth scopes and things like that. And again, there's still a big piece of functionality around the authorization model behind the MCP server in the remote case that corresponds to the authorization model in the local case, because you read about people running agents in sandboxes, which is a great way to kind of put guardrails around that. But even within that sandbox, you may say, don't change the Etsy password, or don't change the logging infrastructure or the networking configuration, because it's going to defeat the point of the agent. But you do need to have those guardrails. Does that? I don't want to sidestep the question.
Oh, no. It's great response, but also you're highlighting, I think, where people's concerns is. You've got two separate security boundaries: the MCP saying, "Hey, we know what we're doing," and then say Unix, it knows what it's doing, and there's a gap in between. And like, I think that feels like people are worried that gap there is not defined or enforced.
I would say I don't feel so much of a gap as like something that's ill-defined in the standard. If you go implement a perfect MCP server right to the standard, it doesn't say anything about.
Yeah, it's just another Unix application,
that, right? Yeah. So I mean, that's a really hard thing to standardize, right? What your agent should have access to, but it is 100% an important thing for you to be thinking about as you build out your agents. It's just not something that somebody else can dictate. So I don't know if maybe it's a gap in terms of implementation. People need to be very aware of it, and maybe people haven't been, and that's a good thing to call attention to.
And that's where, too, I'm glad you both started that discussion, because I wanted to talk about the granularity. And I'll bring in that granularity of authorization. I'll bring in the auth-z aspect, because we started about authn. And part of that is because if we're just talking about, the Unix file system, very simply, we could say read, write, execute. Those are some permissions that we want to manage. Maybe we don't even want an agent to have access to the file system. And that's where some of the sandboxing comes from, because that agent is only supposed to interact with another API. But if we start to get here, my mind then goes to, well, we've had SE Linux, and that has wonderful granularity, but I don't know if we can, how successful a poll will be of users who have implemented SE Linux in any type of appreciable blocking mode. I do see John raising his hand, so we'll bug him about this in a moment, but I think he knows where I'm going with this. So the question subtly there that I'm working for you out here, Dan, is if we start to talk about that granular authorization, how then does that, is that kind of part of that gap you're describing? Is that something that even OAuth can handle and accommodate? Or do we need something else that we got to expand these specs to figure out what do people intend to do for the agents versus the reality of what they actually can do because they just aren't restricted?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I don't think we're going to be able to look to the standards bodies for this other than maybe some super high level guidance, because your server is different than my server, which is different than. I think that we want to think about the fine-grained, what I would consider to be like fine-grained authorization behind these systems. I don't think a standard is going to save us, but I think you 100% need to model that kind of stuff, because the one thing that I'm learning more and more as I dig in is that you can expect human beings to kind of follow known patterns, or to be somewhat reasonable, or even maybe a fair way to put this is to like not exhaust all the possibilities, whereas agents, because their software, can exhaust all the possibilities. So I think a sandbox, again, is a perfect example of a deterministic guardrail that you put around agents, right? Like you're running this Docker instance. Obviously, if there's a Docker exploit, the agent might find it, but like that's a bigger problem for a lot of different people. But you can set those guardrails. The same is true of permissioning structure for authorization models behind an MCP server, or even kind of a Unix file system. You need to think about what that looks like in a world where something's going to be kind of probing at every piece of that guardrail.
Yeah, and I think it's very fair to say, like, a Docker escape is nothing, it's unrelated to MCPs. That's not a problem that MCPs suddenly introduce. It's just that we would have to be worried about the malicious MCP or malicious agent skill, whatever the latest term is these days, or feature is getting pulled in. But part of this conversation, I do want to bring in some more acronyms, because we haven't brought that done enough yet. ABAC and RBAC is coming, so there's my foreshadowing. But before we get to that point specifically, John, the SE Linux angle, there's a bit of it. I was kind of joking that it's wonderful to have, but it feels like so few people implement it in any type of enforcement mode because it can get so complicated. Yeah, is that?
I was raising my hand just in like I'm one of those few people who've implemented it. But the thought there, sandboxing is something us security nerds used to think about and do. And, the actual going to trouble of creating like a sandbox for your HTTPD server or something like that, or the vast majority of people haven't touched that because they quote unquote didn't need it. And I think this is sort of showing a weakness there. And a path you could go down is maybe having like hardened OSs. There's a story I'm just putting into to bring into news where someone has the concept of, since we have LLM coding agents, do we need to have all these frameworks? And by which I mean like UI frameworks or OS frameworks, or it could even be file system. So I mean, I guess one of the thoughts could be here is, if you have those AI coding agents, do you need to have a full-fledged OS underneath, or can it go and just create the bits it need, or actually install them? And then you're back to the trust question again. So I'm not sure.
I just want to jump in. I think hardened OSs are great as a possible solution for, again, local MCP agents, right, or local agents. And I think that's a whole class of problems that are very relevant, right? Like Claude's, what's that? It's a new release where it's the thing that can, in Claude desktop, it can, I think it's called
Cowork.
Yes, exactly, Cowork. So it's a whole class of problems that we definitely need to solve. What I'm really interested in is kind of the remote situation, which again has an analogous thing to a hardened OS, but it's behind essentially an API server, and there's all kinds of resources that are not necessarily file system resources that you need to think about how to protect those, right? Like, how do I make sure? I mean, a perfect example is like, I was playing around with an agent and I wanted to give it access to my Google Drive, but I didn't want to give it, and MCP says, do you want to give it read access, write access, ability to create directories, yada, yada. But I couldn't, through MCP, say, I want to just give it access to this one folder. What I had to do is I had to create a service account in Google and then grant that service account access to that one folder, and then have that be the thing that my agent authenticated with. Well, that works great as long as Google has built out the idea of service accounts and the ability to grant a certain folder to a service account. And that whole infrastructure is the authorization that is fine-grained that I was talking about, that you need to build out.
It shouldn't have to.
Yes. And that's what feels like there's a premise behind MCPs of relatively easy to spin up. Look, this now works. It interacts with all these APIs, low level of work, but Dan, you were just highlighting to make this work with not even confidence, let's say comfort about how it's interacting, it does need that granularity. And this is where I did want to pull in maybe a little bit of teasing apart those nuances of RBAC, ABAC, because my mind comes to a good example. It was very helpful for you to say that Google Drive. If we have the file system, equivalent, read, write, execute, we can throw in like sticky bits, a few things that influence how directories are created, and Mac OS does have extended attributes you can apply there. But I don't. That feels like that's a lot of implementation to put on your API. But it sounds like it should be done. How does anybody even start? What should they be thinking of to either just have a threat model in mind, to have an architecture model in mind, a solution for that, so you can say, so I don't do the classic AppSec mistake of apply ABAC and walk away. There's actually got to be some guidance there. What would that guidance be? I'm looking to you as the expert, clearly, more than me.
Sure. Yeah, so I think that just so I understand your question, you're basically saying someone is spinning up an MCP server. It's a remote MCP server, so they're not leveraging the file system, authorization model.
They're interacting with that remote API, like you're describing, right?
And then what are they thinking about, like, in terms of, like, what are the first steps to think about building your authorization model? Is that basically your question, or did I misunderstand?
That's it exactly.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to do is to be familiar with the different authorization models. And I'll give a quick overview. One is RBAC, which is role-based access control, which basically is very coarse in terms of its big picture, read, write, edit, view, our common roles, and you assign an AI agent, in this case, one of those roles, and that gives it access to different kinds of operations it can take on an API. The second is ABAC, which is, you can think of, it lets you choose RBAC, and then you can layer in attributes that are applicable to the particular permission request. So in a role, I can say, Dan has this role, so he gets access to that for all time, for all requests. ABAC lets you bring in time of day, IP address it came from, is this particular resource protected or not protected in a certain elevated way. And again, those are all business logic specific, but you can kind of build those things in. Reback is the other model
Regular
that you
expressions?
want.
No.
Sorry, it's ABAC is attribute-based access control. Reback is relationship-based access control. And with Reback, it is the common thing I point to is Google Drive, right? Where you have a folder structure and you get hierarchical access. So if I give you access to the top level folder, you have access to everything below it. If I give you access to one of the leaf nodes, you don't have access to anything above it. And a folder system is an easy way to think about that, but you could think about that in terms of a department or other kinds of hierarchical organizational structures as opposed to just a file system. So I think that's the first step, is to think about these things and which of these maps onto your problem space. Lots of times I talk to people who do have a natural hierarchy, right? And it might not be, one of them was a travel agent, right? And so they have a high level agency, and then they have teams within that agency, and then they have trips that are trip teams, and then, the actual participants. And each of those entities, this is the human example, but you could imagine it's applicable to the agents as well. Each of those entities has different permissions to different things.
And all of those, and thank you for that explanation, because that gives us also, I want to offer up a degree of complexity, if you will, in the sense of RBAC is pretty simple, ABAC, and then maybe even the reback gets a bit more complicated because you have that graph of okay, here's where the node I'm at. What kind of transitive permissions do I have? Authorizations do I have? And as we've seen classically, I'll bring in Microsoft Active Directory is just notoriously difficult to secure, or subtle mistakes that people made, and suddenly they get pwned by the ransomware or by the pen testers. So in this case, Dan, I'm curious if we were to use our kind of 2010s API mindset reference, were people even struggling with that ABAC or that reback even back then? Is LLM, in other words, introducing even further considerations in our threat model and our complexity of implementation, or are these relatively known types of architectures that are just nevertheless complex? They take time to implement.
I would say it's more like the latter. I think that there are some people doing some work around formal proofs of these kind of things. The Cedar language is one that I've heard of. And then Permify, which is a product that my company offers. Actually, I don't know if we have formal proofs, but we definitely have a testing framework that integrates in. And I think that's one of the things that when you're using these models, you want to build some kind of assurance, right? Because you don't want an edge case to take you by surprise. No. And that actually is an argument for externalizing it, right? Not having it be strewn throughout the code, because that is one of those gaps that I've seen where people, put stuff in code, and it's totally legitimate to start out doing that. I understand the reason, but like there are libraries and frameworks out there that let you externalize it. And one of the benefits of doing that is it does make it easier to audit it, makes it easier to test it in a way that gives you assurances.
Well, let's, if you can, like, walk us through why it's easier rather than I trust you, but I think can be show don't tell in the sense of maybe just riffing off of the Google Drive example. How would that trade-off be between litter all these authorization points throughout the code versus here's my enumerated list of endpoints and the policy or the decisions thereof?
So you're asking why the second case is easier to understand.
Yeah. Walk us through that.
Yeah, sure. I think there's a visibility argument for one, right? Where you have a centralized location that you can see where new permissions are added or new endpoints are added. And when you're kind of looking through the code, if you are very experienced with the code or you know the questions to ask, you can probably find that same information. It's just not going to be front and center. So there's that aspect of it. The other thing I would think is that can actually turn up inconsistencies in a way that, again, it can be, you might be able to see the same inconsistencies if you're familiar with code base, but it's going to be more effort, which means it's harder to do. And then I guess the other kind of thing I would lean on is the auditability, right? If you have something in a central, well, actually, I have one more thing after that. You have something in a central location, you can make a change. And again, you could see those changes if you had the checks strewn throughout the code, but they're going to be mixed with other changes, and it's going to be hard to kind of like extract out like, okay, I added this new permission or I extended this permission in a way that I might not have wanted to do if it's mixed in with a bunch of other commits with other features. And then the final thing is by centralizing the authorization logic, you make sure that like things, and again, this takes some enforcement too. It's not free, it's not easy, but like you can make sure that like things all call that same permission structure or that same authorization logic. So if you have multiple different apps or multiple different APIs that are all kind of accessing the same data but in different ways or through different, generating different formats or what have you, then you can still have the same authorization logic. I think that last one is probably for much bigger organizations. It's not super useful for a single application, but that is one of the benefits of centralizing.
And there's a subtext I hear in that too, is that you're describing very much a security-minded approach in the sense of it's more visible. It's more deterministic. I mean, you already said, formal proofs being able to apply to this type of area, but that centralizing the logging of the visibility also helps with things like fuzzing, because you can more easily just say, here is the scenario I want to fuzz, go forth and conquer and see, do those bugs, where are those bugs? Where were those weird interactions that expose, oops, we made a mistake here. I think my follow-up question then is, it makes sense how you're describing it as the subtext of security, but very much easier for developers just to think about. And I like that as your emphasis there. Where does that go in the sense of, do we need another top 10, OWASP top 10 list of how to have your API better? Or is this part of the MCP spec that needs to say, well, if you're interacting with a remote system, you need to have granularity? That I'm being a little bit facetious there, because I don't think anybody would say yes, but I'm kind of poking at where does this go instead, because we need something.
Yeah, this is something I've thought about. Like when we talk about MCP, I don't think anybody is going to expose a remote MCP server without some kind of authorization model behind it, right? And I think that it kind of exists and whether it's kind of wrapped up with your code or in a library or in an external server, it does exist. So I don't think, other than like, I mean, OWASP does feel like a better place for it than MCP, and I know you were being facetious about MCP, because this exists whether you're using MCP to contact things or whether you're using agent to agent or whether the agent is using raw REST calls, right? Like, it's a fundamental problem that I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I don't see it being addressed in the agent world, and I don't know whether that's because it's new and most people are doing stuff locally, and so they rely on those kind of sandboxes or Unix file system or YOLO mode, or whether it's something that is just so known that like it's like water that a fish is swimming in, that we always are like, of course you're going to have a fine-grained authorization model. But when I look at, like, again, the Google Drive example, like, I need to take all these steps to actually have fine-grained control of what my agent had access to, and it wasn't. And Google, by the way, is a very sophisticated operation, right? Like, yes, they know what they're doing. The average person the average B2B SaaS or company that's exposing their MCP server to like let somebody get the very real productivity gains from AI agents, I don't know if they're going to be doing that, right? I can dig it up, but I think Asana, which is not a small operation, they're a kind of a task tracking system, in June of last year had like an MCP like bug where someone could access, I think it was other tenants' data, and it was just because they didn't have their authorization model right. I'd love if OWASP would do something like this. I know that authorization stuff is continually towards the top of the top 10 for the general OWASP security lists. I don't know whether there's enough to have it be like a full-on separate project, but it is this understated thing that I just want to call attention to. Like, you've got to be thinking about this kind of stuff.
And part of that, jokingly, yeah, we've got RBAC, ABAC. I do want to introduce my regular expression back. I think we've got YOLO back, which you just described there. Vibe back is going to be one of these. But all of these backs, they're going to break our backs, if you will, if they turn into, do you want to grant this? Do you want to grant this? Because I can also foresee an anti-pattern of, I'll pick on Microsoft a little bit again, once again, won't make a habit of this, but the pop-ups of, this cert, there's a problem with this cert. Continue. Everybody clicks yes. That's a classic problem. Have you seen that with successful granular implementations, but then, an MCP or a non-MCP environment starts to prompt the user, do you want to grant this access? Or, you're using OAuth to log in and you're granting access to your Google Drive. Do you want to do this, 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 and this? Do people pay attention to the granularity? It's one thing to say, yeah, let's have it. It's another thing to say people use it. Is that an anti-pattern you've seen just from the user experience perspective?
I mean, I think that it is 100% anti-pattern and is something we're going to have to address, because you can't, there are, there's a spectrum of comfort, right, that you have as a user. And I think that the more people do stuff with AI agents, the more comfortable they're going to get. But I think that we need to start out with letting AI agents ask the user for permission. But to your point, like, that is if it's once a day, that's okay, right? If it's 5 times a minute, then I'm going to kind of just totally zone out. And I think that the real answer is that you have to, you can't rely on the user for this, right? And again, to your point about MCP scopes, I think most people who connect their MCP client to their Google Drive don't even think about like what kind of other limitations they need to apply. And so this is really a plea for us to, like, as application developers, do this kind of granularity thinking, right? And don't assume that the people who write the standards have thought all the way through the whole line, right? Like, I mean, they definitely are doing what they can, and the MCP spec has improved over time. I don't know, frankly, whether there's a space for the standard to improve other than maybe like best practices, right? Like that would be one thing to say, like, hey, make sure you think about what the authorization model looks like behind your MCP server, but they can't say, oh, you must implement ABAC or you must implement REBAC, because that would be that'd be useless. That'd be useless guidance because it's so dependent.
That does seem weird, and it seems like you're also creeping into a weird scope of don't tell me what to do spec. But I think on that theme, I just want to check with John, when you were talking about going back to the SE Linux aspect, was that aspect of this becomes so granular? I know SE Linux doesn't pop up do you want to do this, but was there a situation where you found that it became too cumbersome for the end user and you had to roll back, or you had to introduce that, allow star type of thing? Or can Granular be successful, that how Dan is being, describing?
I got really good, unfortunately, with SE Linux debugging. And I think part of the thing here, if we go down this path, is, it's like, it's not just creating those YOLO back, but providing the tools to be able to debug when it's actually blocking something. How do you make it easy, right? Because people weren't complaining about SE Linux. They were complaining about how do you troubleshoot this thing and actually figure out how to use it. But what I'm seeing out in the field is people look at these MCPs, and it keeps asking, trust this, trust this, trust this, but still it's not really, it's just saying trust yes or no are temporary. It's not saying with these arguments. And I think that's where people, at first they just go YOLO it, say, hey, do everything. And then as they get bitten or they see their neighbor get bitten, they're like, oh, that's not good. So then the next step there is, well, how do you make that better?
And that's so Dan, how do you make that better?
I mean, that's why I'm on this call, right? You start by educating people.
Yes.
And I think that there's a couple of different ways to do this from an authorization perspective. The first is 100% make sure the agent has its own identity, so that that's foundational. Now, as I kind of implied with my Google Drive example, that's not necessarily always what happens. Sometimes it has delegated authority. Sometimes people, will just let their browser be driven by an agent, which means that there's no separation of identity at all. That's my kind of easy answer. The hard answer is you have to kind of do the work of limiting things and then having, and I don't know whether anyone's doing this. I'd love like an automated path for like escalation, the same way that you see modeled in like even just human departments, right? Like I have a credit card that has a certain amount. If I want to spend over that, I have a designated path to do this. I'm not sure that and I'm sure there's people out there kind of working on this problem. I'm not aware of that, but that seems like one possible answer too. It's like, what's the next automated solution?
No, that's cool. I think some of maybe the next automated solutions, we probably can't predict them right now, but we can also refer to what are current solutions. And Dan, we've included some blog posts from you and your work. And so I want to say thank you for writing those. I also recommend people to check out the letters to a new developer. That's just some good general writing about approaching software. So I want to say thank you for that resource as well, Dan, and thank you for joining us on here.
I appreciate it, and I am sorry that to dear audience, I'm sorry we didn't come up with any beautiful answers. Like all we did was come up with more questions, but
it's AppSec. We just ask questions. Developer Security Weekly are the ones that actually have to implement and have deal with solutions. But speaking of deal with solutions is 3 words of my own making right there, Dan. And we always ask our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. So how would you approach that question?
Yeah, my 3 words are fundamentals still matter. I think that people kind of have stars in their eyes around AI agents and, some of the amazing possibilities that are available with them. But like deterministic guardrails, we talked about sandboxing, we talked about logging, like all these things become even more important in a world with non-deterministic entities that act with the speed of software. So fundamentals still matter are my 3 words.
That's one of my, that's definitely jumping up to the top of the list of one of my favorites. Thank you, Dan. That's a good one. So I want to thank everybody else for joining us to listen to us talk about all things granular and coarse. We're going to take a quick break now and return with news of the week. Generative AI is powerful, but it comes with real risks. from prompt injection to data leakage misuse and agentic AI. The OWASP GenAI Security Project unites a global community of expert practitioners who tackle these challenges every day. Together, they've built practical playbooks, adoption guides, and the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs, resources any team can apply right now to strengthen AI security. And it doesn't stop there. This is open source, built by practitioners, for practitioners, working together to secure generative AI. Visit securityweekly.com/OWASP to use the playbooks and join the effort to protect tomorrow's intelligence today. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Dan Moore about MCPs, APIs, ABAC, RBAC, I made up regular expression back, and why granular controls have to be part of the future of LLM security. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella, and it's time for some news. But first, it's time for my favorite announcement about Zero Trust World, because most security conferences talk about threats. Zero Trust World lets you attack them, which still sounds like it lets you attack other security conferences. From March 4th through 6th in Orlando, Florida, this hands-on cybersecurity event features live hacking labs where you'll break real environments, think like an adversary, and learn how attacks really work. You'll also get expert sessions, real-world case studies, CPE credits, and networking with top practitioners. And the Security Weekly team will be there. Not me, but the others. Go say hi to them. Register today at securityweekly.com/ZTW. And speaking of ZTW, as with all these news, John, there's a WTF in some of the, I think you knew where I was going there with that. I do like to start out with bugs and flaws. And here is a security incident on Plone GitHub org with, drumroll please, force pushes. And I pulled this out not to pick on Plone or any of the CMSs. We could probably have WordPress Security Weekly if we really wanted to and talk about plugins all day long. Mm-hmm. But this was, there was a focus last year on package managers, platforms. And here is related to that. We're pulling in github.org, for example. But it was really the in the write-up, almost the top, the TLDR is disable force pushes on your default Git branches and maintenance branches. And the reason being that a developer's account was compromised. There was a force push made through that compromised account. That force push contained malicious code, and that's not what you want to have. But the funny thing is, I'm going to ask right off the bat, John, have you ever force pushed to main?
I'm sure I've done it at least once, but, not a good way to make friends.
I will also have to admit I have done that because, boy, when you can mess up a branch, you can really mess up a branch. But force push, this is one of those things that's bad. And I'm joking about this because it also feels like one of those easy things to disable by default. And so that's kind of the obvious part here. But another thing that was interesting is that, where is this? That this project has been around for a long time. And to quote from this article, that means there's also people who have not contributed in years, but still have write access to the code. And it was one of those developers who hadn't been a contributor for a long time, but at one point in time had established their identity and trust, to riff a little bit on our conversation with Dan just now. And that trust was broken because their account was compromised. So it was very interesting just to see, again, how do we apply access controls? And that feels a bit more of an ABAC scenario in the sense of when was the last time you were active? That type of thing, rather than just you have write access to this repo. So that did make me want to try and bring the streams together, if you will, rather than just talk about force pushes.
There's a psychological aspect here, right? It's I've done work for multiple open source packages, and when you become a committer on there, that's a great feeling while you're getting recognized and getting that access to help contribute more directly. But I know I have been slow in the past to remove a committer if they haven't been active for a while, because you've given them that gold star. I'm like, you don't want to take the gold star back.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's if you don't monitor and maybe they get to keep the gold star, but they need to jump through a hoop when they do come back, if they come back. But I can understand why that exists, but this is the result.
This is sadly the result, but there are ways of, that disabling force push would have helped them as well. So there are ways of maintaining that constructive community environment while still having security. I don't have a good segue for this other than I did bring in a couple articles that I wanted to talk about where we're leading into more of a discussion as what's going to happen in 2026. I say with a sigh. Who writes code? LLMs are humans. Who analyzes code? LLMs are humans. And what's the difference? But before we do, here's an article from Watchtower Labs. We've grabbed a couple of those. The title is "Someone Knows Bash Far Too Well, and We Love It." And it's really just about an Avanti Endpoint Manager mobile. It's 2 CVEs. But the point of this article, it's once again a very entertaining but nicely detailed technical article, where Watchtower was looking at some code, and they see this is some Java, but it's calling into the command line. It's calling into Bash. Can we manipulate that? And there's a fun way to look at this, is that one of the things they did was they just grepped through some code looking for potentially insecure areas. So they didn't even need a fancy SAST tool or an LLM. They just used my favorite grep. But the surprise here, the big reveal, was that they found a bash shell that was basically just doing arithmetic. And in that arithmetic, they were being defeated with exploitation because they're just dealing with numbers. And here's the bash dealing with numbers and numbers. But what they discovered is a bit of a quirk here, John. And this was definitely new to me. Definitely, I'm not a code golf or bash shell kind of person. But to quote, during arithmetic expansion, if a variable is treated as an array and the array index contains a command substitution, basically backticks, the shell is going to execute that command. So what they found was, here's a variable that they could influence. They threw in some backticks into that variable. That variable was put into as an array value as part of basically A plus B. Lo and behold, Bash was like, it looks like you want to execute some code. Let's execute that code for you. And that's what the big reveal is. So that was really fun.
The overall post is great. Trolling F5, I'm here for it. These guys, I'm sorry, I'm not in a position to buy your software. It's just not where I am in the world. But hey, I'd pay for a Substack subscription. I'm loving these posts. That sentence you quoted, I had to reread that 3 times. I'm like, really? Yeah. Great write-up. It is just, it's I don't know. Part of me wonders, when they write these, are they, obviously they're writing for their own entertainment to a degree, but is their customers, are they getting tickled by this, or is it more for us? I don't think it's just for us. I mean, we're talking about them yet again, but the marketing part of me sort of wonders the root of the purpose here.
It's definitely a smart marketing strategy because I fall for it every time. Mm-hmm. But before we leave this particular article, the other reason I brought this Bash part was, in the world of AppSec, surprising behaviors are always bad. You don't want them. There was old school PHP had what was PHP insecure. It had a flag that everybody misunderstood, didn't use properly, and it changed how code was executed, and it changed some security boundaries. That is just one example, and I'm sure we could point to other configs and other languages that can be surprising, I didn't know how that would happen, and that's what you want to avoid because of security consequences. And here, John, I'm curious, Java calling into a Bash shell seems just like an anti-pattern. That's going to be my word of the day for this episode. That's a code smell. Why are we using Bash? And so could I convince you, in my love of refactoring, could I convince you that we need to have some engineers rewrite this shell script into even just Python, even just something that ostensibly maybe has some typing or can be better tested, or that is not so inscrutable that you're not sure if this is Bash, Perl, or hieroglyphics?
I did see the mention of refactoring in there. I knew it was going to catch your attention. The smell here for me was, why are they compiling the Java code on the instance? Why don't they just download the class? So that seems sort of weird. There's got to be something they're trying to support. I mean, Java class is supposed to be multi-architectural, so there's something weird there I'm not quite nailing. Maybe you know. Yeah, it's back to YOLO regex, right? They're doing something in that space again, and you're like, I don't know what's going on here. And I was also thinking about what's the performance of running a JVM as part of your rewrite. That also seems a little fishy. So maybe you don't need to be super performant, but that seemed a little weird in there too.
Yeah, and it does feel like when we see vulnerabilities like this, it does make me, one of the things I would love if CVEs had was also a dimension of how old was the code base and how old was the commit that introduced this vulnerability. Because my hypothesis is that older code is worse code, and more modern code, we aren't going to see those cross-site scripting and SQL injections or other types of patterns. I'm sure I could be proven wrong, but it would just be really interesting to see that, especially for code bases that have been around for a long time. Is your team introducing new vulns, or are they cleaning up the old ones? And speaking of cleaning up old things, I'm not sure there's much to talk about here, but it's an article off of the Windows IT Pro blog called Advancing Windows Security, Disabling NTLM by Default. And really, this is less about NTLM specifically, which is just horribly insecure. It was known to be insecure from the very beginning. This was back in the days of the Loft was pointing this out when NTLM was first released, that it's just bad crypto, bad how it was password hashing. But here it just is like, wow, it takes a long time to deprecate something, disable something, and get people off of that so they're more secure. So this is just more of a shakes fist at the sky, like, why does it take so long? But at least it's happening. I don't know. That's the best thing I can think about for this.
Excuse me. It'd be interesting to see it'd be interesting to see a talk or a paper explaining why it waited this long. My guess is, again, refactoring and waiting for old codes that wasn't being maintained to go away. Yeah, that's... hang on a second. Okay, no, she joined. I thought like the article was first written in 2022. I'm like, no, 2026 article. Yeah, and there's a lot of dots in there, and it's when it's actually going to be disabled by default. But I don't know. I'm sure there's reasons. It'd be fun to sort of see that, what good reasons they have. But
yeah, and I'm sure they definitely boil down to business and customers. Just we can't migrate off this. We're stuck on this, etc. So, who needs their ATM to run a modern version of Windows these days? But part of the reason I pulled that into, part of the reason talking about the bash and JVM from the Watchtower, is also there's a theme we're definitely going to be visiting this year of who's writing code and does it matter who writes the code? And I'm implying here humans versus LLMs or agents or whatever flavor of GenAI is brought together. And John, you've got an article here that touches on that a little bit, but in an angle I didn't expect. Introduce this article for us.
I would love to do so. And the first point here, I will provide this to our jury listeners. I'm presenting this as a think piece. I think the article is taking a bit more of a one-sided approach to it. Found it on Hacker News. You can go and see both sides of the argument there. But the idea here that the author is trying to put out is, hey, we don't just have LLM coding agents anymore. We now have LLM coding swarms with the latest versions of OpenAI and Claude from Anthropic. But since I'm able to, take a swarm of agents, and we're hearing all these incredible stories, like I think Yandex had him acting like 50 employees or something like that, sort of crazy. So some folks are able to get these to do significant real-world coding. If that's the case, and you've got these really intelligent, great people that you're able to provide very detailed instructions on how to do things correctly, do we need to be using frameworks like Vue.js or Angular or maybe an OS framework or an ORM, and we'll talk about those later? Do we need those things when we've got this, sentient, let's not say sentient, relatively smart robot that's able to do coding all day long, do we need to use the frameworks, which might have bugs in them, it might have a lot of baggage, they might be really big, might be a big download when you only need like a button, or do you just have the robot do it? So that's sort of the thought that's being put out there.
It definitely prompted I want some more time to think about this one for sure, but it definitely prompted some immediate reactions. One is just that from a security perspective, if you came to me with this, John, it's a lot easier for me to ask, are you using React? Because the reason I'm asking that is, how protected are you from cross-site scripting? Can I grep for dangerously set inner HTML anywhere? But if I can't ask, but if you say no, I use this swarm, my own, my swarm framework. I don't know how to ask the same question. I just have to say, did you follow the OWASP top 10? I'm not sure. Yeah. Well, how would I interrogate you on how secure your code is?
I mean, you're leading into another article there, but there's both the interrogation process, but also, as I said, minutely telling it how to do it right. So I want you to not use Angular or React, but I want you to create a button that is well-defined, is reproducible. I can clearly read the code. There's no cross-site scripting. I don't know, there's probably 10 other things I should be mentioning in there. So yeah, maybe the framework we end up going to is having markdowns, which tell the robots how to work correctly instead.
Yeah, exactly. But I will concede that having honestly a well-written markdown sounds like, do you want to call it your PRD, or just your feature requirements, your use cases, etc. But having a well-expressed problem statement, I'm trying to use business neutral terms as much as possible, is also just helpful for the humans too, right? And so that seems straightforward. And on the opposite end of the spectrum for me, rather than just like, hey, use Reacts, in the world of something like NPMs, I do like the idea of, well, I have 100 different packages that are my dependencies that are a pain to maintain. Just pull out all of the lines of code that I'm using out of those packages and write it for me, customize it. So maybe I can actually get rid of 100 packages and 100 dependencies to maintain and have like literally only 1,000 lines of code. That would be wonderful.
Or could you go the other way with this? This is really going to, our listeners' ears are going to bleed on this one. Maybe you could give it instructions of, hey, get the latest version of React and remove everything which isn't specific to this one functionality which I want.
Yeah, it's really kind of boiling down to, I want static compilation for my JavaScript is sort of what I'm describing here. Yeah. That's one of the unsung, maybe, or not greatly sung benefits of Go that I will throw out there. It has nothing to do with the memory safety. It's more of just the code that compiles is the code that it uses, rather than all the other cruft. But John, as you were predicting, you start to notice my patterns here. I was setting up another article we had this week from the title. This is from Wiz Research and Irregular. Irregular is yet another. Speaking of marketing, there's so many articles I've been grabbing that are from new AI startups, but at least they, I think, are offering up interesting articles to talk about rather than just being pure marketing fluff. So let me know, listeners, how far down this path I'm going. But this is testing AI agents on web security challenges, what we learned. And so they basically set up 10 CTF, 10 lab challenges, and had a human pen tester go through them just to confirm that these are legit challenges. What could a solution look like, or what is the most likely solution to look like? And then they turned a bunch of LLMs and said, hey, go find vulnerabilities. And there's a couple more nuances to that beyond just go find vulnerabilities I thought were interesting to tease out here. But John, maybe even with that, having that swarm, do we use frameworks or not? Using LLMs for security analysis rather than just the coding itself. I'm curious, when you see an article like this, how has it been grabbing you? What have been your reactions?
It's getting better, right? If you came to me last summer and said, or even a month ago, and said, hey, I'm thinking about replacing all our existing static analysis with an LLM and having it just do it, I'd be like, maybe not the best idea. In 6 months from now, what am I going to think? I'll be more open to it. Would I still say throw out all the other tools except for this? I mean, part of the problem here we're not talking about, even on the last article, there's a cost of these things, right? They're not just running for free. This article at least sort of hits upon that briefly. But yeah, they're massively more expensive to run than static analysis or than a lot of the other tools where your good old favorite grep, it's like, a fraction of a penny compared to running an LLM. So, and that has to come in at some point, I think, on these. And I'm not saying it from a managerial point of view. It's more just like, if you want to run these things in your business, you've got a budget for that too. And I think that can't be overlooked. You have to budget for it. Sorry. You have to budget for it, and it's not giving you that amazing result. So we're getting there, but.
Yeah, and if you were to look at this article, they have a table that just says, the 10 challenges, the vulnerability type, the AI result, which was 9 out of 10 times the AI did succeed, and it showed the cost, which I greatly appreciate as well. But I'll also pull out that the AI result, did it succeed or not? There's a little bit of a nuance, because how many runs did it take to succeed? And even they point out in this, what they say, in the Shark, router resellers, and content SSRF, basically 3 of the scenarios, models succeeded in finding the flag in 30 to 60% of runs. So, okay, we got to play with some math here. That basically means you've got to run your LLM about half a dozen times in order to find the flag. And the cost of that, at least here, maybe we're still in the world of VC subsidizing these, they're on the order of $1 to $10. That might not be the true cost, I'm going to whisper, but not knowing what the true cost may be. But it's one of those questions like, okay, even if we said I've got the credit card to pay for the $10 per run of this, how many runs do I need to run? 4?
Yeah.
And I'm secure. Do I need to run 5? How do I approach that?
At least in my world, the story I was describing there a little bit, if I'm going to make this part of my CI process, and I've got, say, 20 developers, and they're checking in, a few times a week, and each time it's going to cost, if I'm checking for each one of these challenges, I don't know if it sounds like they ran it individually for each one of these, and maybe not. I'm not trying to overinflate, I'm just trying to understand. But if it's costing, let's say on average, 50 cents per test per run, we're not sitting here, I don't think, but usually these guys brag about how many hundreds or thousands of things they test for. Again, it starts to get expensive. And also time-wise, these things usually don't run that fast. So they're improving, but at least in my mind, as you said, as I asked myself, I wouldn't replace everything else.
Yeah, so I almost say, like, how long does it take to run? How much did it expend? And how many developers do you annoy by delaying the CI/CD process? That developer annoyance factor needs to become an official, IETF metric or something like that. There's another example here that I think in spirit ties back to the frameworks article that you brought in. And I'll quote again, testable objectives are important. Our challenges had clear win conditions. Without flags, the agents produce more false positives, exaggerate findings, and struggle to identify what actually matters. And the reason I wanted to highlight that is that I think this article is good about not just overinflating the results or adding to hype, but avoiding that gut feeling of just talking about AI agents based on headlines or based on, oh, look, they can find 9 out of 10 of the same vulnerabilities that humans can without paying attention to the cost and the time that we just talked about. But also, too, if I were to, I'm pretty sure, John, you're not sprinkling CTF flags within the own code you're writing so that LLMs know that they can find this. I don't know. If I say that, could I convince you to put in some CTF flags into your code, and that's way rather than just writing a bunch of prompts?
That'd be interesting. I'm just thinking how that sits with me. I think it's one thing to do. We're at part of the thing here right now is we're at this time where very seldom, I think, do you have full software development teams that are drinking this Kool-Aid. You might have a few in there that are open to try it or experiment with it or add those CTF flags. But for a significant portion of the team, a non-zero portion of the team, you're going to be annoying them by adding this. So that's also, there's a bit of that balance of like, how do you do that particularly in a larger enterprise? I think in a startup where, everyone's drinking the Kool-Aid, they're cool with it, but no pun intended. But in a larger company, in an enterprise where you've got, like I said, 50 or 100 developers, I don't know.
Be something to think about. And this is, dear listeners, this is clearly a topic. Writing code, analyzing code, humans versus LLMs. That's our 2026 SmackDown. We'll come up with some good wrestling intros for that and everything. But while I think of that, there's one other article I wanted to just squeeze in and reference a little bit. We're going to come in later on this month to talk about in detail is the top 10 web hacking techniques of 2025. So this is James Kettle and the Portswigger crew have been doing this for 19 years, which is pretty wonderful, which is basically, as they describe, community-powered effort to identify the most innovative must-read web security research published in the last year. And I love that highlight because it is in fact community-driven, and it's a celebration of research, basically the human creativity. So you can see a little bit of my human bias creeping in here. But I wanted to frame this as, for example, none of these were earth-shattering, the internet was broken, or this is the heartbleed or shell shock or type of level of vulnerability identified, but they're very instructive. They're very well written technically to understand a type of attack, and they're people who are paying attention to those dusty areas of RFCs, whether it's the HTTP2 Connect, again, really fun one. There was another one about the top one was about using, I'm scrolling around, sorry, using SS server-side template injection and basing it off of the errors that come back in Arithmetic. So once again, it got some cool math nerdery in there. But John, you mentioned a little bit earlier in our discussion, you're teasing that we're going to talk about our ORMs. Yes. This was showing SQL injection-like data enumeration through misapplied filtering and, basically the core parallels that you could draw to regex is not exactly matching the beginning and end of input. But this is me just, I wanted to fanboy that framing a little bit to celebrate how these are written. They're explaining technical areas, and they're also giving a lot of references to prior research. And it's that nod to prior research that I think is also another great example of just, here is the positive way of showing AppSec building, understanding, and continuing to learn from research. So that was how I wanted to throw this together. And maybe I did in 60 seconds. John, I know I haven't put you to sleep because I didn't mention cryptography in any case. So
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How did you like this?
So yeah, my favorite list was number 2.
Yes.
It's just, I don't think of, you think of, we told people for how many years, like use stored procedures and then preferably use an ORM, and that should get rid of most of your security issues, or at least from that aspect from SQLi. So it's always fun. I mean, we were talking about surprises earlier. Surprise, your ORM's is also got an issue. I will cheekily say, hey, if we had an LLM writing an application and not using all these things they talk about here, SOAP, ORMs. There was another one on my Next.js. So we had my wonderful fleet of robots writing the perfect code. Just think about how many less issues we'd have here. And then once you folks stop rolling your eyes, think about how many years it's going to be before we get there. I think the last thought here for me, but it's sort of interesting about this. I might have said this last year too. I think I probably heard about a third. I don't think I got half of these or last year. I don't know about you, Mike. So there's just so much going on out there, like really great research that we try to bring it in here, but it's as try as we might, it's still hard to catch all of it.
It is. And I think, I forgot to count, but I think we're only close to a third of these that we actually covered. So this is a wonderful way of, so kudos to Portswigger and crew for also just highlighting what are the work people doing? And this won't be the end of the discussion on it. So that's why we haven't dug deeper into some of the technical aspects, because the ETAC one is, I think, possibly one of my favorites in here too. But we will do that in some future episodes. So I want to say thank you, everyone, for having the patience to get through this one. I want to thank John once again for joining me and being able to talk through the news. And please do remember to subscribe, check out the show notes, share us on the socials. And speaking of maybe getting ready for some wrestling, check out Hammer Down by Jesse Mock. Throw in some synthwave to your life. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.